Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Azure podcast with your hosts Sam Foote.
And Anne Armstrong.
If you're new here, we're a pair of Azure and Office 365 focused IT security professionals. Each episode, we talk about a specific topic in the space. This week, it's episode 9 of season 3. We're going to have a chat around the Azure Developer CLI, AZD. Going beyond the existing Azure CLI, this command line interface gives developers tooling which assists with building, deploying, monitoring, and updating applications in Azure. Hey Alan, how's your week been?
Hey Sam, it's not been too bad so far. Busy. How about you?
Yeah, not too bad. I had a trip into the city today, which was a little bit more exciting than just navigating to my desk, like it like it usually is. So that was good, and luckily, public transportation was on my side. So yeah, it was pretty good. It's quite interesting because we are so like consistent with our uploads. Not much happens in between, to be totally honest with you. Um, but no, so what we are talking about this week is the Azure Developer CLI. I'm going to sort of take the lead on it because I've been um, playing around with it. Just to give you a little bit of context, I would say Alan and I are in the Terraform camp when it comes to infrastructure as code and sort of declarative infrastructure. Um, so I learned about the Azure Developer CLI from I think it was an Azure Friday YouTube video, I think originally. Um, so I've been playing around with it. I'm trying to work out if it's something that we should look at, to potentially replace our sort of Terraform pipeline. So yeah, let's go over it. I don't, Alan, have you looked at the Azure Developer CLI at all?
Nope, not heard about it until I've seen it on this podcast. Because, as you said, I've been getting into Terraform since you introduced it to me. So
Okay, cool. Let's get started then.
yeah, so Sam, what is the Azure Developer CLI?
Okay, so um, I think it's worth talking about the Azure CLI to start off with, right? And let's talk about what's well this is here today, but let's talk about if you were to use a CLI to manage Azure, that is Microsoft, sort of controlled and managed. We'd look to the Azure CLI. The Azure CLI is very the coverage of it is very wide, and you can just I suppose in some if you're just talking about say the creation of resources in Azure, that part of it is very similar to something like a Terraform, right? um, what the Azure CLI, so let's say you wanted to create a resource group. Let's just use that as our running example, a really simple example of a resource you might create. Want to create a resource in Azure, you could either use the portal, you could go in there and configure it yourself. You could use the Azure CLI to do that. So you could download the Azure CLI, authenticate with it, and then run a command. RG, I think it's just azrg create, right, and pass it some parameters, um, and that can create you infrastructure in Azure. Um, where that sort of stops beyond before you get to an infrastructure as code perspective is it's not declarative. It's not state driven either. So um, what we mean by that is the life cycle of that resource is then not controlled by anything. So you get your resource group, but then you can't track any changes to that resource group. You can't, if say I create a resource group and then Alan comes in and adds an unauthorized tag to that resource group. I'll just use that as a very simple example. I then can't like sort of right side that configuration back to my known good configuration, and that's why infrastructure as code is really powerful because what we can do is we can declaratively say, I would like a resource group with these specific properties, and we can maintain that what we refer to in Terraform as state. So um, what um, what configuration is desired, um, and what is actually out there in the wild. So that's where sort of the Azure CLI from an infrastructure as code standpoint stops. Um, and now, in terms of Microsoft specific tooling, now we're looking at things like Bicep to replace as a translation layer of ARM templates that we've had previously in the past. Bicep gives us the ability to declare resources and infrastructure in Azure. Um, so that's great, and that's another step on from ARM templates because we're writing in I call it a scripting language in order to like loop and create controls like you have in Terraform, where you can sort of dynamically build up your properties for your infrastructure. So Bicep has the core, I'll call it like configuration logic that Terraform has. But what Bicep, where so Bicep is relatively similar to Terraform in that perspective. Bicep is obviously own Azure only as well. So what's the new Azure Developer CLI takes sort of a step forward with that, um, is it adds um, sort of developer friendly commands to sort of automate Bicep deployment, and a CLI that you can use within things like DevOps pipelines in order to automate that delivery of that Bicep configuration. Just to call out, Azure Developer CLI also supports Terraform, which then adds another level of like um, I'll call it confusion on top, because what we've seen with Microsoft's documentation is that you'll sometimes see an ARM template, a bicep template, not a bison. That would be great in the Azure docs. Probably make a mess. You'll typically see potentially an ARM template. You would see a bicep template, and you will also see a Terraform template there as well in some of the documentation. So bicep is an evolution of ARM and a layer on top that, in my opinion, ARM needed in order to be more usable for infrastructure analysts. But maybe Bicep didn't have the orchestration capabilities on its own, and that is what the developer CLI is bringing in. One of the main areas that the Azure Developer CLI is bringing in is this idea of templates. So what you can do is you can, and I'll talk about it a bit deeper when we talk through the walkthrough, is that you can pick from a template and you can build your own templates of multiple different artifacts, which then allow you to deploy. So if you're moving to Bicep, um, the developer CLI is going to give you a lot more control, because one of the main areas that it covers is not just infrastructure. And this is one of the challenges that we have internally, is how you manage your infrastructure, but then also your application code as well. So let's say you're deploying an Azure function, just as a random example. You need to build the infrastructure that sits around that Azure function. Maybe your Azure function talks to a SQL database. Maybe it talks to a Redis instance. You need to have all of the infrastructure in and around that. And then once you've got your infrastructure ready, you also need to deploy your package. So with an Azure function, you would effectively create effectively a zip file with all your binaries and all your code in it, and you'd run a deployment to run it up into Azure. Now that could all be s- uh, it could all be done in the portal if you wanted to. If you didn't want any infrastructure as code, you could script it in a like a a local PowerShell script or a Bash script with the Azure CLI to deploy it all for you because all of those endpoints are there. Um, then you could take it one step further and add Terraform to add the infrastructure element to that. But the bit that's kind of missing from that side of things as well is the application code. How once you've committed your latest changes, do you use Terraform to deploy your infrastructure? Then after Terraform is completed, do you then run another pipeline to use the Azure CLI to you know well, you wouldn't use the Azure CLI, you would use like the .NET SDK to build your function package, and then use the Azure CLI to then, or an action in GitHub Actions to then publish that up to your infrastructure. So you've got two parts really there, and two things that you have to maintain the life cycle of. And I think what and that is okay if you are a large enough team where you potentially have like uh, admins that look after the infrastructure, and then also people that look after the application logic and code as well. But what can happen now is we can have a blurring of those two lines, where you in your team you might have a DevOps professional, and they might have to cover automation of the infrastructure and security and potentially hardening of that infrastructure, and also the actual deployment of new packages that go out. What can also be a challenge is orchestrating changes to infrastructure that are required by new code releases. So let's say you update your Azure function, and now you need to use Cosmos DB, you know, um, and maybe Cosmos, so you have to then uh, your Terraform and your infrastructure as code is then intrinsically linked to the requirements of your application logic as well. So in some respects, keeping the application code and the infrastructure together makes a lot of sense, because they can be reliant on one or the other, if that makes sense, and and working out the relationships of deployment can be a little bit tricky, especially if you have a complex application.
Wow. Okay. So that sounds quite interesting. Um, yeah, I guess is there any you kind of said about Azure CLI not having any state? Is there any state with Developer CLI?
So Terraform, the way that Terraform works is that it's when you use a provider in we've done an episode on Terraform. If you haven't
Yep.
listened to that episode, go and listen to it, because if what I'm about to say doesn't make sense and it's all in that episode, it probably isn't, actually, to be fair. But Terraform uses what's called providers. So there's a provider for Azure Resource Manager. It's called Azure RM. And what Terraform does is when you run it locally, it is using the logic inside of that provider. It does not talk to Azure to validate any of your syntax, any of your configuration. So what you can have is that you can have things, and then what it does is when you actually deploy, um, Terraform then hits all of those endpoints to deploy your resources. And then what it does is it captures the output from those API calls. Effectively, they use the Go SDK, but the output that comes back, and then they store that as what we call state. Um, and that's effectively a JSON file which says, this is the resource group, this is its IDs. If you've ever looked in the properties or the JSON view of a resource in Azure, that's effectively what you're getting, plus some other stuff in your state for each of your items. Now, bicep, and state in Terraform is really important, because if you lose your state, when you try to redeploy or do an incremental deploy or a change, Terraform's going to go, there's a bunch of stuff here that already exists. I'm not going to overwrite that for you. and there is a process where you have to go through and import that back into state. So what Terraform does is it allows you to store state locally. It will create like JSON files for you, and you can store state remotely, like in a storage account, so that if I make updates, on Monday, my changes are made and stored in that state, and then if Alan makes changes on Wednesday, when Terraform goes to deploy again, it reads that state in to understand what is new and what has changed since the last time I've been there. Bicep doesn't have a concept of state. It uses an incremental deployment like methodology where because Bicep can, if you authenticate, Bicep can do incremental deployment to Azure without any sort of state management whatsoever. And because it can basically on the fly work out what has changed and what needs to happen directly in Azure. I don't know the reason why Terraform has state under the hood. My assumption is because Terraform, well, like the vast majority of platforms are supported by Terraform. So I assume that any, even if the ARM like REST API can from Azure can tell you, whether you can incrementally deploy, it might be that Terraform just takes a blanket approach. That's just my assumption because of all of the different, like working to the lowest common denominator, basically. So Bicep is really powerful from that perspective because in theory you don't need state for it. You can just incrementally deploy every single time. So but the thing with the developer CLI is it's utilizing what's built into Bicep and even Terraform, and there are a few like limitations and things like that. But it's just building on top of that to help you automate that even further, effectively to get your application code into your deployment as well.
Okay, cool. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but what environments does it support?
Okay, so we've talked about, well, it's Azure only. It's a Microsoft, enabler for Azure completely. Um, you can install, you can use install it and run it on Windows, Mac, and Linux. And it's designed like that so it can also be run within inside of development DevOps pipelines as well.
Okay.
Just to talk about environments a little bit more. Um, so when you run um, when you run the when you run the developer CLI, you can either run it like bare metal on your laptop, for instance. You manage all of the dependencies that you need to run Azure. The Azure does. I'll call it AZD because that's its effective name. Like the AZ API. The AZ CLI. This is the AZD. So AZD require you can just run it. Like for instance, that's how I ran it. I just installed it on my machine, and I'll talk about the process a bit more. But then I just effectively downloaded a template and hit run. I authenticated, and away I go. You can also run it inside of a dev container. If you're a developer, dev containers within inside of Visual Studio Code effectively give you a pre-packaged development environment inside of a Docker container, so that you can deploy all of the you can manage your local development environment a lot more granularly than relying on like global packages on your machine. And it can also be run inside of GitHub code spaces as well. So if you use code space for a code space is like a remote. If you've ever used Visual Studio Code remote development, I think it's called remote development. I think that's what it is. If you've ever used that, that's effectively a code space is a virtualized environment that's hosted inside of GitHub that you can. It's effectively, I assume it's just like a Docker container that you remote into, and you can run it inside of a GitHub code space as well.
Okay, great. Um, okay, so how does it work? How do you use it? You kind of talked about some templates, but step us through the process of using it.
Okay, so I think it's Okay, so let's start off. Effectively install the CLI. Step one. Good documentation on how to do that. I do just want to call out at this point, it's currently in preview. So that's why we are looking at the moment, because as new technology comes on, we're constantly trying to find potentially new and more efficient ways to work. So um, you install the CLI, and what's interesting is that you can effectively, like you can with the .NET CLI, that comes with a bunch of templates. So if you want to start a new .NET project, like you want to start a function app or a React SPA or a web API or whatever it is, very similar to that, there's a bunch of pre-baked templates, and that's what I worked with to start off with. So I picked it's a to-do list that uses an Azure function with API management and a single page application on the front of it. So it's actually, even though it's just a to-do list, it was quite a I'm not going to say complex, but there was a lot of resources that it deployed. I think it deployed about 13 different resources, something like that. So from a infrastructure perspective, it wasn't just a simple app service and away you go. It was kind of sort of an end-to-end example. Um, there is also a community website of templates. So it looks like Microsoft's trying to foster a sense of a community around potentially people building their own templates and then sharing them with the community. On that website, there's also a place that I think you can, it's all driven by GitHub, I believe. And you just, you tag I think you tag a repo with a request in it or a gist or something like that. And it comes up and you can basically request other people to help you build a template. Um, so there's a cut that when I looked, there was a couple on there of people that wanted specific templates created. Um, One thing to call out with the documentation there is Microsoft made it very abundantly clear that templates could be licensed by third parties with different licensing. They called that out specifically and quite prominently in the documentation, which I thought was interesting. So maybe they're going to foster some sort of maybe paid community, because I assume that templates could be quite valuable. Companies could build templates for certain things to accelerate development of other teams potentially. It seemed more like an open source sort of community thing, but you know, um, it wouldn't surprise me if they try to layer on some sort of other incentive there. Um, for the moment, let's just pretend that we're just want to using one of the pre-baked templates, and we're happy with that. You effectively authenticate with AZD. It'll push you to a browser to authenticate. You come back, nice and easy, and then you can do a deployment. And what the deployment will then do is it will ask you a couple of questions about what the environment is. So let's just talk about environments. You can have separate environments for dev, staging, prod, and maybe prod one, prod two, whatever you've got. And you can have different environment variables and configurations for each of those environments. So environment management in Terraform, I'm not going to say it's complex, but you've got to think about it when you're creating your Terraform strategy, how slice up your environment variables and parameters and things like that. If you opt for HashiCorp's paid enterprise product, management product, effectively, they take that away from you. But that is an area where that is quite, I'd say, lacking if you don't have experience with Terraform. But Microsoft have that straight out of the gate in terms of how you manage your environments. And then you effectively do an AZD deploy. And what it will do is it will just go in, create the resources for you. Gives you a link, which is cool. And then you get, what's the page in Azure where you see the deployment, like the deployment plan? You can, like you do in the portal, it links you to there so you can watch everything deploy. The first time I ran it, it failed because I tried to deploy to UK South and something wasn't available there. Can't remember. There's something in the example template that isn't available in UK South. Can't remember the exact thing. Anyway, it deployed everything but failed on one thing. So then what I did is, because it failed, I I went to inspect all the things that it put in. Was a bit cheeky because it like put in things like a really expensive SQL server. Like the if you create a SQL server via the AZ CLI, the default one is like a standard V core model or something. It's like 250, $250 a month or something like that. That's what it deployed. It also deployed API management as well, which is quite expensive. So little bit, well, not cheeky there. Like I didn't read the template. I just deployed the thing because that wasn't the bit that I was looking at that time. So yeah, so it deployed all of those things. Mine failed, so I did an AZD. It's either down or destroy. I think it's down, and that removed everything pretty quickly. Actually, to be totally honest with you, um, I didn't try incremental deployment or anything like that. I just ran it and deployed it again. It deployed all the infrastructure, deployed the app, and effectively I could go to the single page application straight away, and it showed me my to do list, which was really cool because it not only deployed my infrastructure, it also deployed my code as well, which I thought was pretty neat considering that's sort of um, a sort of a more advanced scenario with Terraform and baby DevOps pipelines as well, right? Because if you configure a DevOps pipeline, in that DevOps pipeline, you could have a lot of scaffolding in order to get certain things into the correct states and configuration and to deploy. Like I mentioned before, you make sure you do your infrastructure, then you work on app packaging, and then you might make separate DevOps pipelines. In theory, you could make a pipeline which is just simply AZ deploy, and AZ deploy is the sort of the engine that's going to drive those changes inside of it as well. What I didn't try is there's a way to, I believe, create that pipeline automatically for you as well. So there's a helper in there to create your pipeline. I didn't try that, but apparently that's there as well. So you can effectively go, I don't want to deploy this from here. I would like to deploy this from a pipeline and a Git push. So that is also it will also go and create those pipelines for you automatically, which again is a potential, um, place that you can spend a good amount of time configuring that, especially for multiple environments as well. Right? You can sometimes have to have multiple pipelines for each, environment potentially. Depends how complex things become. So if your requirements fit inside of this, that can help a lot with that. Just to call out as well, currently the only supported. This is really around it's really designed for developers. So we're talking Azure App Services supported in terms of code deployment, Azure Functions, Azure Container Apps, and Azure Static Web Apps. So SPAs, React, Angular, Vue.js, that sort of thing. And then apparently Azure Kubernetes service is coming soon. So, but I haven't even looked at that. I think we should probably revisit this one once that is here, has landed, because I think Kubernetes orchestration could be unreal, really, because that's like another level on top, really, of potential configuration complexity. So it's good to see that they're focused on that as well. Um, just to quickly talk about as well, there's a couple of deployment modes as well for for Azure Resource Manager. So you can effectively do an incremental deployment between the changes to resource groups, and then you can also do like a full, I believe it's called a complete deployment, where it deletes all the existing resources. Um, um, and then it can clear out effectively resources that are inside of the um, uh, the resource group basically. So incremental is safer, and then a complete can completely wipe everything and start from fresh basically.
Okay, yeah, so it's definitely got some characteristics of Terraform. From what I know of Terraform, anyway. Question: Talking about incremental, I'm thinking about some of the things we've done with Terraform and things like that. Um, Say we decide to change the name of a resource. Is it able to do that name change, or will it create a new resource because it's not really matching against what was already there? If you kind of see what I mean, because with Terraform, obviously you got the state, so you can say that now needs to be destroyed, and I need to build a new one.
Yeah, I didn't actually try renaming, to be totally honest with you, because that is a because naming cannot be changed in Azure,
Hmm.
right? That's usually a destroy and recreate. I'm I didn't try that scenario, but
Okay.
I'm gonna probably guess that it's gonna be a destroy and recreate, as it currently is, would be my thought process.
Yeah, no, that's cool. That's good. Um, yeah, it sounds quite interesting. I definitely think I need to look at it as well because we do quite a few things, don't we? With what we're doing. Um, so yeah, kind of. Is there anything else that's different between Azure Developer CLI and Terraform? Is there anything else that's different?
Um, I think I suppose the question really is more bicep versus Terraform, really,
Yeah.
because this is. But if we're talking about the deployment of infrastructure and I suppose code as well, because bicep is effectively a scripting language that outputs ARM templates. It's a way to not have to write all of that horrible. Um, I say horrible. I shouldn't really criticize the ARM templates because I understand why they're very verbose, right? Like because you're declaring resources in Azure. There's a lot of boilerplate there with templates that Bicep allows you to effectively skip over. I believe Bicep is also based on TypeScript, I think. So you get a lot of um, in Visual Studio Code, you get a lot of autocomplete and type aware checking as well in Visual Studio Code. So I think from um, Bicep versus Terraform is a comparison. I think we've talked about that, but I think a developer CLI to Terraform. I think what what we see is Terraform is not going to that application code
Hmm.
management level, and that is what Microsoft is doing here. It's they're coming at it from the viewpoint is well, if you create infrastructure, you've got to deploy something to it, right? And they don't support all infrastructure. It's the PaaS offerings that they're, you know, where they have that first party integration with, right? So, for instance, if you need to do things inside of virtual machines, IaaS, Terraform is the way to go because there are providers to help you with that. If you're deploying anything to on-prem, Terraform is the way to go. If you're deploying to other clouds and other services, Terraform is the way to go because developer CLI is only Microsoft, only Azure, right? So that's because some applications, some applications I worked on in the past use specific PaaS tooling or SaaS offerings from different cloud vendors, right? I know might sound mental, but like I know people that use cognitive services in Azure, but actually host their applications on AWS. If you're in that scenario and you want infrastructure as code, then Terraform is the only way to go. Really, if you want cross cloud compatibility. Um, so I think Terraform is focused on I'll call it a subset, but say half of the you know um, half of what's there, and Terraform is good. Well, Terraform is an amazing product, but it's good on many different platforms. Um, and what Azure Developer CLI is completely focused for Microsoft tooling and solutions, right? And we're seeing a tightly integrated product here. If you can, um, if you can live with that as your only focus, and for a lot of organizations, that's absolutely fine. And for a lot of the solutions we deploy, for instance, that would be absolutely fine, right? Um, so, but I also don't think what I'm really interested in is how this compare because Alan and I do a lot of logic app deployments, so no, and workflow logic app deployments. So not the what's it called like
The standard
standard logic apps where you actually have like a effectively an apps a service
app service,
environment,
yeah.
don't you? App service that runs your logic apps, and you can do much more with it. But it's quite expensive, and you have to think about high availability and things like that. So we love workflow based logic apps, and technically flow based logic apps quotes cannot be um, DevOps, but we do that. We do manage our logic apps with ARM templates or Terraform where applicable, and we have got workarounds with that. What I'd really like to see is um, what I'd like to try next is comparing what we have to do Terraform side, try and replicate that in Azure Developer CLI. Because if we've got access to Bicep, we have access to ARM, and if we've got access to ARM, we've got access to ARM deployment of workflow logic apps, right? And so it might give us a better workflow and process for managing those workflow logic apps. So I think the only way we're really going to know for some of our projects is comparing them against them.
Yeah.
So that's my sort of viewpoint.
And it was kind of going to be my question, or my sort of statement, I guess, that because it supports Terraform, that you can kind of migrate to it, can't you? I guess that if you've got your infrastructure set up in Terraform at the moment, and then you're looking at you've got that missing gap, like you said, with the code, then you could start off with by using Developer CLI to sort of bridge that gap. And then maybe as you need new resources and things like that, maybe you look at Bicep if you're Azure only, of course. Well, this is for Azure only, but you could start moving to Bicep maybe if it makes sense to, kind of thing. So you don't have to worry about stripping it all out. You have to start from scratch for your infrastructure. I mean, some of the projects we've got, Sam, are massive, aren't they? And it wouldn't necessarily be too difficult to switch over because we've worked all the logic out that we need, which has been the hardest part. But yeah, at least there's a way of migrating or improving your current solution for deploying your application and code, or your infrastructure and code, I should say. Um, and then you can migrate as you need, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to bash on Terraform at all, but there's some inherent things with Terraform which make it a little bit more challenging to work with. You are reliant on updates to those providers to reflect changes to the APIs, that are in place. We have also seen that where there's I call it like preview APIs, and things where there's not coverage in the providers, where you have to go to what's a thing called AZ API, which gives you like direct access to the REST API. And Microsoft have created that as part of Terraform to bridge some of that gap, which is really good. On the whole, I'm not being critical of Terraform. I'm just saying because they are outside Microsoft, they have to change and track the management of that, and they do a really good job of doing that. But this is completely first party Microsoft side, right? Like Bicep. As long as Bicep has the ARM changes, you've got the latest version of Bicep, you've got those ARM changes in there. You're only waiting on Microsoft to do those updates, right? And so that's the big a potential win for me, because they're the ones managing that ecosystem potentially as well. So, but but yeah, because when you create a template in when you download a template, there's basically two folders. Well, there's multiple folders, but the two folders really are where you've got a YAML file which maps all the services. Kind of reminds me of a Docker Compose file. Not going to lie, it looks very similar to that. Um, so, but that maps all of the different services that you're deploying, kind of like Docker Compose. And then the other side of that is you have folders like, for instance, there's an app folder which has your app code in it, and then there's a infra folder which has got your infrastructure in it. that could potentially have Bicep in it, or it could have Terraform if you wish. There are some limitations. I won't go into that, but definitely check the documentation out. It's all in preview anyway, so this is all like subject to change, and this we haven't tried this into production yet. Like we haven't, um, because the organizations that we work with, this isn't something that we would even approach with them until we've got a GA and a proper release from Microsoft, so where we can actually run on it in production. But it's really interesting to see that they're coming from both the infrastructure and the app side of things.
Yeah. Okay. So we kind of talked about some of those limitations, and one of them being, it is Azure only. That's like you said. There's pros and cons to that because it's first party, so you're getting everything pretty quickly to the code. Um, and it's preview, so it's not a limitation, but there may be some things that aren't out yet, like the Kubernetes piece. Um, is there anything else that's kind of a limitation?
I think for me that there's going to be an inherent limitation with people adopting it. It is another layer on top of if you're there's a new set of tooling, there's a new CLI, there's new um, like reference architecture that you need to learn. So there is an inherent upskilling element to that. So it's going to be driven by people. It's currently going to be driven by. I personally think it's going to be driven by people that are using Bicep, but they maybe want to improve their processes and their workflows. One thing I haven't called out actually, which I should have called out, is you can actually monitor your applications with it as well. You can run a command and it effectively shows you um, the application insights like of your of what's going on. So it's not just deployment and updating; it's also monitoring as well going forward. So understanding what's there and the functionalities and the features and changing over your internal processes, there's something else to learn there. And the only other thing I could sort of think of is because it does sound like a really good idea. AZ Azure only being a potentially a big limitation to some organizations, but not to everyone, because some people are single Azure cloud only. And there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Um, is currently in preview. There's potential a lot of change with it. If you're learning it, you know, expect there to be changes. Microsoft are very different nowadays. They build in the open, I would say, a lot more than they ever used to. So just remember that when we talk about it, and I am excited for this technology for sure, but this is not a conversation that's going near a customer for a long time. And I'm not being critical of Microsoft for that. Um, I just making sure that Microsoft are going to build an ecosystem and they're going to get enough engagement from it. Because are people gonna people like us were happy to uh, potentially. I'm not even going to call it waste some time. Invest some time into learning of whether this is good for us or not. Other people might just be like, I've dedicated um, my infrastructure career to Terraform now, and that is, that's transferable skills that I might not be completely wed to Microsoft in Azure, and I might want to take those skills elsewhere. So there could be an element of. I'm not going to say there is because I don't know yet. Um, but there could be an element of people, making sure that they're on the right bandwagon, basically. Because personally, for me, I've got no real problem with Terraform. It does its job and it does its job really well. So part of the other side of me, maybe I'm getting a bit old and a bit cynical, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It is my sort of default stance. But I also think that we should give new technologies and new ideas, that people have the time of day to learn about it. It's quite obvious that a lot of really good efforts, engineering efforts, have gone into this, and I can really see very rapidly why it's could be so valuable. But it's just going to be a case of comparing against, what you're currently doing. It could be a big change for you. Could also not be a big change for you. if you're currently managing things via Azure CLI and you've got no declarative, maybe you're just using Bicep, to replace your old ARM templates to start off with. Maybe this for people that are Azure only using ARM templates and now Bicep, this is a natural progression into the developer CLI to give you so that you don't potentially need. So like we've had to go and learn DevOps, creating those pipelines and things like that. This could be a good enabler for you to kickstart your DevOps transformation journey, if we want to call it that. It's a bit of a I don't really know if I should call it that, but this could be a good start to that process potentially.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one thing is that to say is that me and Sam are always on private previews, public previews, so we've kind of got into that mindset of don't expect it to be completely working. I guess is the answer. Is the response, isn't it? That there are bugs, um, not often, but there are some out there, and that when you're using preview stuff, you just got to be in that mindset that it's not necessarily going to be perfect. And that's one of the reasons why it may not go straight. For us, it might not go straight to the customer. But learning that it's something that we can use means that you can be prepared for it at least. For when it becomes generally available, or it's you're happy with the functionality that it's got, kind of thing. So,
Yeah,
so
I mean, personally for me, the way I see it is that well, we know firsthand the engineering output that Microsoft can deliver, right?
mm.
Across Azure, Microsoft 365, like it's unbelievable. Like I'm going to call it impossible to keep up with everything, right? That's happening. Um, and that is just part and parcel of being in the eh, well in tech. I'll call it in technology. That's just the way it's been for a long time, right? It's just people are continually evolving and changing. So so to me, I think the investment of time is understanding whether Azure Developer CLI fixes some of the challenges that I have with my current tooling. I'd give it the time of day to do that. And personally, that's how I've always been. I come from a development background where new frameworks, frameworks flow in and out of hotness all the time, right? And there are constantly new changes happening there. So yeah, proceed with caution, but also I would say proceed with optimism that potentially this could, potentially help you. Um, that's what we want at the end of the day. We're all inherently lazy, and we should be, right? We should let like tooling, like from my my development background, programmers are inherently lazy. They just want to automate everything, right? Like, why have humans do anything? So that level of declarative, replayability and control is a massive bonus to infrastructure. When you first start doing it, you might think, I can just configure this in the portal in 2 minutes. Like, why would you bother doing X, Y, and Z? Um, but when you start to use infrastructure as code and these management like principles and life cycles, you understand, especially when you have to rapidly rebuild or test or validate. Try doing an infrastructure test plan without Terraform. Like, yeah, good luck to you with a large deployment. So, um, so, so these things are potential massive time savers. And what that comes down to is either your organization or your customer effectively could get a more efficient service from you. So you could have a key differentiator of you know um, of others that are maybe testing and deploying manually, which is for me the biggest thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a converted infrastructure as code person in the last 6 months.
Yeah, well,
Um,
the thing is when you open like I know this isn't a Terraform also, but when you open like Terraform configuration files, you're like, like what the hell is this to start off with, right? And then when you like kind of understand that it's just like blocks of ARM templates, basically, it's not ARM templates at all, but it's like blocks of ARM templates that are just easier for you, and you've effectively got to run a couple of commands to deploy it. We've had like AVD deployments of nearly 600 resources take, I don't know, like 12 minutes to run or something like that. And then when you got to tear all that down and and test a DR scenario and then things like that. And we actually have like projects which are like declarative infrastructure as well. So like a multi-tenancy scenario where you've got to add more resources for particular um, customers or verticals or whatever you've got. That's where infrastructure as code can really shine. And that's not just a Terraform thing. That's you can do that in Bicep. Bicep has looping and be able to do that declaratively. So for me, as long as infrastructure as code is being promoted and driven forward, that's the biggest benefit to me. The actual tooling that you use and what you prefer is kind of irrelevant in my opinion.
Okay. So the question that everyone likes to hear, or maybe not, I don't know, but how much did it cost to use the Azure Developer CLI?
Well, as we except for all the stuff we normally talk about where we're talking about, oh, you need E3 or you need E5 or something like that. The Azure Developer CLI is completely free, with the caveat of that you could potentially have to license a template. Obviously, not free to use because you've got to invest your time to build your templates and your things. So there is a inherent cost with doing that of your time. But from an Azure perspective, effectively we're automating Bicep, which is automating ARM and getting consumption in Azure. So it's in Microsoft's best interest for you to more efficiently be able to deploy resources to Azure, right? So completely free. Um, I personally can't see that changing because it's effectively another layer on top of Bicep. It'd be a bit. I think it would be a bit weird to do that because Microsoft are really taking your money from like your code spaces or your containerized development environments or your staging environments, things like that. Not necessarily the tooling to get it there. The Kubernetes service is free on top of the infrastructure, which is a lot more valuable day to day than this sort of thing. So it'd be weird to me to see them license this, but you never really know, do you? Because it's Microsoft. I say that in I don't say that in a negative way, but you just don't know because we're not part of Microsoft, right? Not that Microsoft, pull the rug under us and charge us for things. They usually, personally, when we see public previews anyway, they're very upfront with they'll be like, it's free during you know, the public preview period, right?
Yeah.
They call that out a lot. I haven't seen that at all for developer CLI. So yeah,
Yeah, no, it makes sense for it not to be. I think it makes sense for it not to be have a cost to it because, like you said, it is just enhancements. It's like the layer on top of Bicep and things like that. So yeah, makes sense.
okay. And that's it from me. Alan, have you got any other questions or comments?
Uh, no questions, but thank you very much for going through all that. It was very informative, and yeah, I definitely think I want to go and take a look at it now.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm. My next thing is to try a Logic app. I really want to see what it's like to declare that. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see over the next few months how it develops, and if we do end up putting it into service, I think we should recap with another um, episode on how that went and why we're potentially using it for some deployments potentially.
yeah, well, I've got loads of Logic apps that need deploying. We got on our next stuff. So yeah, let's
Uh,
give it a go.
okay, cool. So next episode, Alan, what are we talking about next? I think this one's for you.
Yep. So we're going to go back to Power Platform, and we're going to talk about managing your Power Apps and your Power Automate flows and permissioning and Dataverse with solutions. So to be able to create uh, Power Platform solutions or dynamic solutions as well. Technically, we won't be touching Dynamics too much because we're definitely not Dynamics experts. Um,
It's
but
not what
yes,
I've
we'll
heard.
be but yes, talking about how you can do use the Power Platform environment to have your dev staging and production environments as well as creating applications that then you can pass in effect manage or send to customers to they can purchase things like that. So we'll go through a bit of that, I think.
Okay, great. That sounds like yeah, it could be a very interesting episode because sort of all the different component parts in Power Platform wrapped into like a solution is a very powerful deployment and management control, right? So yeah, very interested to hear about that. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do consider subscribing if you'd like to listen to more of this sort of content in the future. We have many more topics that we like to cover, and your listens and support is what will continue to fuel the podcast going forward.
We also have the ability for you to give us some feedback. Did you enjoy this episode? Disagree with our thoughts, or did we miss something? Please use the form in the show notes to leave us a message. We'd love to hear from you. See how we're getting on with this, with this series, because we're almost halfway through it.
We are almost halfway through, and yeah, if anybody out there has got any experience with Azure Developer CLI, please do feedback because we've had very limited exposure to it at this point. It'd be really interesting to see other people's thoughts and opinions. Okay, Alan, I'll catch you next week.
Yep. And I'll catch you next week, Sam, as well. Thanks for this episode, and speak to everyone soon. Bye.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. Bye bye.